Hey everybody, it's Rapid. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be having a discussion about some of the issues with close air support or CAS in the game of War Thunder. Now, in order to lay the groundwork for a discussion about the nature of CAS and some of the issues it has and also present solutions, we first have to lay a base groundwork for this discussion. As part of that groundwork, it's very important to understand the difference between something that is overpowered and something that is simply unfun or tedious to play against. If something in a game is overpowered, the answer is obviously to bring down the power level. However, if something is unfun or tedious to play against, the objective should be less to adjust the power level of that item and more to increase the amount of counterplay or agency the player has. Of course, that segues into another foundation that is needed for a discussion on CAS, and that is how powerful is CAS. And this is another fundamental problem with many of the discussions people try to have on this subject, is that CAS is not a single monolithic entity. That is to say, there isn't a single tech tree entry called CAS that you can spawn at any battle rating that universally has the same power level at every battle rating. When you say CAS, you're lumping in vehicles like the B-17, the Etendard, the Alouette, the BF-109, the Su-34, the Tu-4, the AJS-37, the Apache, the Typhoon, and even the Predator drone. This obviously highlights the problem because the only common feature that all of these vehicles have is that they fly in the air. The power level of these vehicles is all over the place. Some are underpowered, some are overpowered, some are perfectly fine, some are very much not. The power level of CAS sees fairly significant fluctuation throughout the game of War Thunder, not just in terms of individual vehicles, but also in terms of the battle ratings that you play them at and the types of weapons they have. This also segues into another foundation that it's important to have when having this discussion, and that is the circle of counters. While a Tiger H1 has very little chance of surviving an encounter with an F4U 4B Corsair, a Skink also has very little chance of surviving an encounter with a Tiger H1. Of course, what I'm not saying with this concept of the circle of counters is that it always works well, and this will be one of the topics we're going to be looking at in this discussion point, is areas where the circle of counters falls apart. However, if a player is not engaging with the circle of counters at all, such as not including air or anti-air in their lineup, and then meets one of those counters and doesn't have a response to it, I don't think that's necessarily a failing of the game. You're given 3 crew slots base and also enough spawn points to spawn generally 2 medium tanks and an anti-air, even if you're getting 0 score, so the balance of the game is not reliant on you being able to defeat every possible enemy you run into with any possible vehicle you could spawn. Or to put that in simpler terms, there's a very big difference between the circle of counters not working, i.e. anti-air not effectively countering the air it can possibly meet, and a player not engaging with it, such as simply taking one premium vehicle or simply taking one vehicle with backups out to record content for a video. In that respect, the focus of this video is not going to be ways in which a medium tank can fight off aircraft on its own or reliably survive air attacks, but rather ways in which the circle of counters can be effectively maintained and reinforced so that there is always an option available to players that wish to engage with it. This leads us to our first point, and one that I am willing to admit may be more on me than the game itself, and that is the overall visibility of aircraft. As the game has gone heavier and heavier on things like lighting effects, weather effects, and particle effects, it has become increasingly difficult to identify what is a speck in the sky or a hostile aircraft. While this can definitely be an issue with fixed-wing aircraft such as props or jets in certain situations, I do find that helicopters tend to be a much bigger offender in this area, especially if the helicopter pilot actually knows what they're doing and doesn't just go straight up into the air from the helipad and actually tries to use terrain to their advantage. Trying to find these helicopters that are actively trying to hide from you both in anti-air and in aircraft is often like playing a game of Where's Waldo, but where Waldo randomly throws a missile at you if you don't find him fast enough. Hands down, my biggest complaint in this area though are the drones, specifically the Predators, the Orions, and the Wing Longs. These aircraft are virtually invisible and almost impossible to spot unless they're right on top of you. It's bad enough that these drones are generally immune to most IR SAMs as they have a very low infrared signature and are difficult to lock, and also most gun-based AA can't reliably touch them either, but even if you spawn in longer range radar-based missile AAs, if they are outside of your radar scan arc, it can often be excessively tedious to even figure out where the drone is, even though it is effectively just flying around in open sky. My proposed solution to this would actually be fairly simple and is already in the game for one specific type of aircraft. If you're familiar with the recon drones that light tanks can spawn, these are about the size of a lawnmower, and yet you can clearly see them from several kilometers away because the game artificially increases their silhouette to make sure players can actually spot these things instead of them simply being completely invisible. Of course, with all of that being said, I am perfectly willing to admit that this might simply be a me issue, maybe maybe I'm just completely blind, so feel free to let me know in the comments down below if you also find visibility of aircraft is frequently an issue for you as well. Of course, that neatly segues into our next issue, and that is that there is rarely enough anti-air on any given battlefield to fend off the air that you are called upon to fight. The lack of anti-air, in my opinion, can be attributed to two major factors. Number one, anti-air is very boring to play, and number two, the rewards for it are also very weak. While I could show you a montage of me getting kills in various anti-airs, what's going on behind you, which is a whole lot of nothing, is what you're going to be experiencing the vast majority of the time you're playing an anti-air. Just a whole lot of time waiting for the enemy to spawn in an aircraft and get close enough that you can actually shoot at them. On top of that, many anti-air in the game are not terribly versatile. The World War II era anti-air can often shred lighter opponents, however medium or heavy tanks are frequently outside of the range of what they can realistically kill, and as you go up in BRs and you start getting to more missile-based AAs, you'll start getting more and more vehicles that struggle to kill even the lightest of vehicles, and in some cases can't kill any ground vehicles at all. The game does give some of the more useless AAs the ability to use active scouting. However, if you have a vehicle like the one in front of you, the Gecko, that is the size of a bus and also handles like a bus, the odds of you using this with any degree of efficiency without just dying are pretty low. This also leads a bit into the anti-air paradox, that is to say, while a lot of anti-air can't effectively engage ground targets, there are some that can. However, when people spawn the anti-air that can effectively engage ground targets, they tend to spend a lot of their time going out and engaging ground targets, and while they're doing this, are not generally keeping an eye out for enemy aircraft. So broadly speaking, you could split anti-air into two main categories: anti-air that people don't like to spawn because they can't really do anything to ground targets, and anti-air that people do like to spawn because they can take out ground targets, however they don't usually end up functioning in the anti-air role. Of course, this also neatly segues into another issue that anti-airs frequently run into, and that is if two teammates spawn an anti-air, frequently one of them is going to be a lot better at shooting down planes than the other. And what this often translates to is one of the anti-air really doesn't get to do much while the other one cleans up all the kills. And given that the average map only has about 4 to 5 enemy aircraft to take out, this is really not a lot of RP for either player. Speaking of RP, given that the average CAS plane costs between 500 to 600 spawn points, you get remarkably little in terms of rewards for shooting one down. This really doesn't combine well with the low numbers of CAS planes typically present in any given map, and also the number of teammates that you will be fighting with for those kills. This combination of factors frequently results in teams, even ones that do have effective anti-air available at a battle rating, usually having very anemic anti-aircraft umbrellas relative to what they could potentially field. As far as potential solutions, this is also one of the more difficult problems to truly solve. The only way to add enough vehicles for every anti-air to potentially have something to do would be for the computer to artificially spawn aircraft, which I think would upset a lot of people. Additionally, increasing the reward modifier isn't exactly a perfect solution either, because it doesn't solve the problem that anti-air frequently don't contribute all that much to their team's success on the ground, so you could also potentially lead into scenarios where half the team is sitting in spawn trying to kill aircraft if you increase the rewards too high. After mulling this over a bit, the best solution I really came up with was a way for players to swap to an anti-air, perhaps limiting it to a once per match deal. The big problem with trying to go from your normal ground vehicle to an anti-air is obviously that you basically lose your ground vehicle. You have to destroy it, which means you're not only dropping some tickets from your team, you're losing a spawn just to go into an anti-air that you might only need to counter 1, maybe 2 enemy planes, which obviously is probably not going to be worth it in a lot of situations. So the ability to more freely switch to an anti-air at least once per match and then go back to your normal vehicle might be a potential solution, although this is one of the areas where I would like to hear more from the audience as to what you guys think would really create a solution to people simply not wanting to play anti-air. The next issue that compounds the CAS problem is players simply not having anti-air available to them. These are often players who go up with squadron vehicles or premium vehicles, and in my opinion this wouldn't really be that much of an issue except for the fact that the game does insist on giving both teams free drones once you get up to a certain battle rating. What this functionally means is that the game is guaranteeing that every player on both teams will have access to a moderately functional aircraft, but isn't taking steps to make sure that all players on both teams have access to moderately functional AA. If the game is going to keep things like Predator drones, Orions, and Wing Longs in the game should also hand out players anti-airs to at least offer them some means to counter some of the aircraft they're likely to see. My proposal to this would be relatively simple. Based on the battle rating that you're playing at, you would get a rental anti-air. These wouldn't necessarily be the best anti-air, and the rewards for them would be fairly low to try to encourage you to actually get your own anti-air, but it would at least be better than nothing. To use an example, and obviously something like this would have to go through some testing and modification before being implemented. Let's say, for example, if you have an 8.0 to 9.0 vehicle, but you don't have at least a rank 5 vehicle in the tech tree, the game would automatically add something like an M163 to your lineups that you would have at least an anti-air. Additionally, if you went to a 9.3 or higher battle rating and didn't have at least a rank 6 vehicle, you would get access to something like the French Roll-in-1 anti-air. Neither of these two anti-airs would be what you would call the best for their battle ratings. They're both fairly modest in terms of their capabilities, but they are significantly better than some 50 cals mounted on the back of a truck for dealing with helicopters with guided missiles and planes with guided bombs. And of course, as soon as you get up to a rank where you could conceivably get your own anti-air that is capable of dealing with these threats, the game would stop adding these to your lineups. The next issue we're going to discuss is one that doesn't come up all that often, but is absolutely infuriating when it does, and this is when one team has no ground vehicles left in the match. If a team has no ground vehicles left in the match, but they do have some aircraft up, the game will keep the match going, and this is kind of a problem because as a player, your objective are to secure the objectives and to kill the enemy. If you're in a medium tank, how do you do that when all of the enemy are in aircraft and you've already secured the objectives? There's really nothing for the average player in this match to do other than wait for the time to tick down. To top it off, you could easily be waiting 1 or several minutes depending on exactly when this occurred in the match and exactly how many tickets both sides had left at the time. In the match in the background, there were 3 enemies left, and I was counting as the kill feed went out, all 3 of those enemies were in Orion drones. There was literally nothing our team could do to interact with them in a meaningful way other than try to spawn anti-air, and this also creates a problem with the drone itself since the drone has a very low infrared signature. Even if we had spawned anti-air, if we had spawned anti-air with infrared seekers, we probably couldn't have taken out the drones before they shot us. In this scenario, the only thing my team could do was simply wait and hope that the enemy didn't get enough kills to bleed our last tickets before the game was over. That being said, while losing a game to an enemy team entirely in aircraft is somewhat infuriating, winning a game against a team entirely in aircraft is just monumentally boring. There is nothing to do. There's maybe 2 or 3 enemies left, you still have a 10-man team and control of all of the objectives. At that point, the game is essentially a foregone conclusion. You already know who's going to win, you're just waiting for the timer to tick down, and the enemy team that is entirely in aircraft are just getting an opportunity with a shooting gallery of your team to get as many points as possible. And this seems a little unfair. Your team has gone to the effort of getting all of the objectives, you have wiped out the enemy on the ground. Why is the enemy being rewarded with several minutes and a free shooting gallery to rack up as many points as they can? While I do feel some players can go overboard in terms of their thoughts on the use of aircraft in a ground RB match, I don't think it's at all unreasonable to say that if your team cannot be asked to get in a single ground vehicle in a ground match, that you should lose that game. The solution to this would be fairly simple. If at any point one team has no ground vehicles on the ground battlefield, it will immediately start a timer, and after that timer has expired, it will start massive ticket bleed that will end the game fairly quickly. As a few notes about this, I do think that players should be given an opportunity to hop back into a ground vehicle, so they should at least receive enough time to do that before the timer expires. And also, I would want the game to make an exception for nuclear bombers. If somebody on one team has earned a nuke, they should at least get the opportunity to attempt to drop it before the timer starts burning down. Now, CAS in the game of War Thunder has a lot of smaller issues that essentially all stem from one larger problem, and that is the way the spawn cost of an individual CAS aircraft is calculated. Now, while I debated looking at all of these problems and looking at solutions for them individually, I actually think that there are some more universal solutions that could be applied to the way spawn costs are calculated overall, so we're going to look at all of the issues first and then look at a proposed solution afterwards. One of the first problems, and one that many people will have already noticed because it occurs a lot at low and mid tiers, is the spamming of CAS. While the suspended ordnance at low to mid tiers is a bit of an issue, one big aspect of the game that I think the developers significantly underestimate is how powerful it is just to have any kind of gun at low to mid tiers in the air. What I specifically mean by this is that a lot of ground vehicles at low to mid tiers are very weak to even just 50 cals, if not some of the 20mm cannons that some aircraft start with, to the point where even just having 50 cals or having 20mm can be enough to make an aircraft powerful by itself. The vast majority of anti-air until you get to the point of radar guided AA are completely open topped and thus weak to basically every CAS plane. Additionally, a lot of light tanks and tank destroyers are as well, and there are even medium tanks like the Panther or the Panzer IV that you can take out through the roof with 50 cals or 20mm. As you go higher up in battle rating, getting multiple kills with just a gun is harder and harder, not just because the anti-air is effective and also because the air is effective, but also because even things like light tanks start getting things like auto trackers and proximity fuses, so your likelihood of getting more than one, maybe two kills with a gun at high tiers, even if you spawn the aircraft very cheap, is incredibly low. Of course, if you're playing an AA in one of these low to mid tier matchups, it doesn't functionally matter what the aircraft is equipped with in terms of suspended weapons, because basically everything in the sky is a legitimate threat to you, and thus you have to fight all of them. And what this frequently leads to is scenarios where you try to take out one plane and then get taken out by the second plane that saw you as soon as you fired your guns. The next issue, and one that is tangentially related to the previous issue, is the fact that there is absolutely no scaling in terms of the way ordnance is costed. And what I mean by this specifically is if you were to take 4 unguided 500-pound bombs all the way down at 3.7, you would pay exactly the same amount of spawn points that you would pay taking those same 4 unguided bombs all the way up at 12.7. And obviously the meta in terms of the types of things you're trying to deal with on the ground and in the air is dramatically different at these battle ratings. The same loadout that would be basically useless at top tier would be absolutely amazing at low tiers. Just to use an example, an SB-2C dive bomber with 4 500-pound bombs and 2 20mm cannons is an absolute terror of the sky at its battle rating, but if you were to take the same 4 500-pound bombs and 20mm cannons and mount them on an F-16C, you would experience significantly less success with that loadout. Another issue with spawn costs is that the spawn cost itself is functionally agnostic to the type of plane you're playing, whether it be fighter, attacker, or bomber, and this creates a bit of an issue because obviously the fighter class of aircraft tend to have the best overall engine power for their battle rating and the best maneuverability, so they tend to be the best when taking on other planes. This gives them unparalleled versatility compared to the other two classes, to the point where every time you have a fighter that has ground attack ordnance that is at least as good as the attackers at its battle rating, the fighter is hands down the dominant choice. Currently, the only reason not to simply take the best fighter at every battle rating is that there are a few attackers that are legitimately quite good, and also that the game does not increase the spawn cost if you take multiple aircraft out as long as they are different types. So all the different types of aircraft is functionally doing right now is allowing you to take more different aircraft cheaper. It doesn't actually differentiate the aircraft types in any meaningful way. Going back to the issue of a lack of spawn cost scaling, and this applies just as much to helicopters as it does to planes. The same tow missiles that are absolutely devastating at 8.3 are practically useless at 12.7, and the game has no accommodations for this. That's not to say that every missile in the game has exactly the same spawn cost. If you were to watch my CAS guide, you would know that's not the case, but the game doesn't change the spawn cost for a given missile based on the battle rating it's playing at. It only changes the spawn cost based on the specific type of missile you're using. And much like the lack of spawn cost on lower tier planes, this also has the same problem of making some of these lower tier helicopters a little too good and a little too difficult to counter for their spawn cost. Ultimately, part of the objective when I was doing the guide on how to optimize your CAS loadouts was not just to look at ways that you could make your CAS loadouts better, but also look at ways in which the system didn't seem to be quite functioning correctly. In this respect, both while I was putting together the guide and while I was playing a wide variety of planes at different battle ratings, I came up with some ideas that I think would actually help some of the issues of certain aircraft and certain aircraft types being dominant or way too easy to spawn. The first overall suggestion, and one that I've been thinking about for a while, is to not have aircraft have a variable spawn cost based on whether they are top tier or bottom tier. In essence, flying CAS in a ground map is very different than flying in an air map with other planes. In a CAS in a ground map, you tend to face a lot of enemies that aren't aware of you or that are in suboptimal airframes to begin with. So whether or not you're top tier or bottom tier is only really a matter of flight performance, and your flight performance often doesn't matter because many of your fights against other planes tend to be very one-sided. On top of that, you only need a bare minimum flight performance to effectively be useful against enemy anti-air. So in that respect, I don't see a compelling reason as to why the game should be artificially inflating or deflating spawn costs based on whether you are top tier or bottom tier. This also becomes a bit of a compound issue because if you watch my guide to CAS loadouts, you would know that everything is percentage based in terms of how it calculates your loadout. So an aircraft being bottom tier isn't just about the base aircraft itself being cheaper, it also noticeably decreases the spawn cost of a given loadout, and this is part of the reason why you can see a not insignificant number of enemies with fully loaded CAS planes but with very little to their name in terms of contributions to the match, only 1 assist or 1 zone cap. This also tends to have a rather unusual impact on high tier helicopters because while planes can go all the way up to 12.7, helicopters stop at 12.0. This means that if you are in a 12.7 match, all of the helicopters will be artificially cheaper than they should be just because they are noticeably lower battle rating than the planes that are in the match as well. Ultimately, no matter how many times I've looked at this, I just don't see a compelling reason as to why aircraft should have variable base spawn costs instead of simply a flat spawn cost depending on the battle rating and type of aircraft they are playing. Of course, this leads into another suggestion in that the base spawn cost of low to mid tier aircraft should noticeably increase. Now, this increase shouldn't be so much that they are functionally inaccessible to the average player and they shouldn't kill the aircraft entirely. But at this point, the game is not really adequate in terms of its ability to cost loadouts, and it also really fails to take into account how impactful guns can be at these battle ratings, even if they're not attached to a particularly great airframe with any kind of suspended ordnance. Once you get up to around 8.0 and above, where radar guided AA is a lot more prevalent, the spawn cost could stay relatively close to where it is at right now and not really do any harm, because it turns out at those battle ratings, gun strafing passes are generally a lot less viable. Piggybacking on that point as well, I also feel like the helicopters that are below 9.0 should all see a slight increase in their base spawn cost as well, since those helicopters are more difficult to counter because you're largely looking at gun-based anti-air, and gun-based anti-air can struggle even with some of the shorter range anti-tank missiles. The example in that one that stood out the most for me was the Chinese Z-11WA that has only a range of about 3 kilometers on its guided missiles, but also has thermal imaging so it can easily pick out the anti-air, and most of the gun-based AA at fights really struggle to do anything against that helicopter. Now, segueing a bit from the topic of the base helicopter spawn cost going up, I don't feel at high tiers the base helicopter spawn cost should go up. However, the game already acknowledges that some weapons are a little too good to first spawn with, even though they aren't anti-tank guided missiles. These are some of the things like the Russian heavy rockets. However, one thing I would argue that needs to be in the same category as these heavy rockets and thus not be something that you can first spawn with is the APDS belt on the 30mm cannon for Russian helicopters. That ammunition belt is far too powerful for first spawning because if the enemy doesn't immediately contest you and you get above the enemy team, it's basically over as you can absolutely shred every tank in the game from the top down. In my opinion, it is this ammo belt specifically that makes these Russian helicopters so obnoxious as first spawns because while the rockets can be fairly powerful, this gun really is far too good. Of course, looking at individual elements that need changes, the KH-38 is the biggest candidate to see a spawn cost increase. At its current spawn cost, it's basically identical to the AGM-65D Mavericks, but the KH-38 features such an incredibly long range that you can basically lock and fire the instant you spawn in and reliably hit targets, on top of the fact they move considerably faster than a Maverick and thus are harder to intercept as well. In all of my games with the Su-34, I found it was incredibly easy to simply get 3 to 4 kills right off the rip with basically no effort, and especially when comparing this with a weapon like the Maverick that usually needs to get closer and is a lot less reliable, it just feels like the weapon is simply not costed appropriately for the impact it has on the battlefield. This for me also naturally leads to a discussion about the roles of different aircraft within the game, especially because the developers have struggled to really balance the anti-air and air situation, and several nations are lacking anything even remotely close to a functional anti-air at top tier. If you're playing a nation like Italy, Japan, or Israel, you're basically entirely reliant on your team to take out these aircraft with these long-range fire and forget weapons because your anti-air are not even close to being able to counter them. Of course, even nations like USA and Britain with the ADATs and the VT-1 missiles for Sweden, France, and Germany can also struggle to deal with these at times as well. So I think the answer for top tier is to allow for more CAP or combat air patrol play. The idea would be fairly simple. You would simply adjust the spawn cost of different ordnance based on the type of aircraft that somebody is playing. For fighter aircraft, they would get air-to-air ordnance functionally for free, but they would have to pay extra for air-to-ground ordnance. For ground attackers, they would pay basically the same as you do right now, and for bombers, they would get a significant discount on their ordnance, as their cumbersome nature and large bomb bays do make them a lot weaker than many contemporary aircraft. Now, part of the reason I suggest this is that the Fox 3 missiles that you will often need to take out these more powerful ground attackers are incredibly expensive to spawn. They're not that much cheaper than the fully loaded ground attacker itself, and if you've watched my video in terms of how this is costed, the air-to-air missiles for these ground attackers fully loaded with these air-to-ground loadouts are functionally free. You don't pay anything extra to bolt on some R-77s to your Su-34, so you're going up against enemies that have Fox 3 missiles, but in order to take out your Fox 3 missiles, you end up paying a small fortune. Discounted Fox 3 missiles for dedicated fighters would of course allow for more counterplay to these high-tier ground attackers, but the increased cost for air-to-ground ordnance would also be a soft nerf in the process to make it to where they can't simply do everything. Or to give a practical example of what I'm talking about, an F-16C with Mavericks would be more than an F-15E under the current system, but could also take AMRAAMs for free if it didn't want to take any air-to-ground ordnance, whereas the F-15E would still be a very expensive aircraft if you wanted to take it fully loaded with air-to-ground ordnance. It would be cheaper with the air-to-ground loadout than a contemporary fighter like the F-16C. Now obviously, as this is just a preliminary proposal, there's a lot of testing needed to fully implement a system like this, and there are almost certainly going to be some aircraft that break the mold. However, in these cases, the game could simply use subtyping to allow aircraft to have appropriate spawn costed ordnance based on their role. And of course, the game already uses subtyping. If you're subtyped as a VTOL aircraft, you can land and rearm on the helipad, so the game already has coding to use it for certain aspects, so I don't see why you couldn't also use this for determining spawn costs for ordnance loadouts. Of course, like with any change in a game, there would be considerable testing involved in all of the individual spawn cost changes that I've proposed to make sure it doesn't break the game or make aircraft unplayable or inadvertently buff things that it's not trying to buff. However, I think it is at least worth looking into a major change in terms of how aircraft spawn cost is calculated, given that there are a few too many aircraft in the game that can be spawned for too cheap, but there's also several aircraft that essentially have no role because they're going to be prohibitively expensive. One thing I brought up at the beginning of this discussion was that you should always be prepared to separate something that is unfun from something that is overpowered. Generally speaking, if things are unfun or if players don't like them, it's usually because they are uninteractive or the player feels like they have no agency or no control over the outcome that's about to occur. In this respect, one of the more frustrating aspects of CAS is how the top tier missiles tend to just come out of nowhere and absolutely annihilate you. These missiles, as you get closer and closer to top tier, have ranges that extend all the way out to 10 plus kilometers, so the aircraft that fired it might not even be visible on your screen as anything but a black speck in the sky. What's interesting about these missiles, they actually do have counterplay. KH-38s, Mavericks, Spikes, and even things like Hellfires do have a counterplay element, and most vehicles have access to it, and it is simple smoke. These missiles generally do not track well through smoke at all. However, the problem is not that counterplay doesn't exist, but rather that the player often lacks the information to use it. Anyone who's played a vehicle with a laser warning system and successfully avoids getting hit by a predator drone will know how satisfying it is to avoid these hits, but that's only because you have the laser warning system. Infrared and TV seekers do not give you any warning whatsoever. It's almost impossible to see these missiles coming, so unless you just happen to be looking at the right section of sky at the right time, you basically have no idea that a missile is on its way. Interestingly enough, in one of the older esports events, one of the players did earn enough spawn points for an F-16 with a full load of Mavericks, and proceeded to get 0 kills. A good portion of the reason why he proceeded to get 0 kills was every time that player would fire a salvo of Mavericks, the enemy team would let everybody know that it was time to pop smoke. This level of coordination is obviously not really viable in a casual setting, but there are at least small measures the developers could probably implement to help that process. In Air Realistic mode, despite it being obviously somewhat unrealistic to do so, the game actually adds missile markers to the map so that you can see when incoming missiles are present. This doesn't always help you to avoid incoming missiles, but the developers obviously decided at some point in the past that getting smacked out of the sky by something you couldn't see was more than a little frustrating to play against. And I would argue by that exact same principle that at least some form of missile marker should probably be implemented to ground realistic mode. While I will admit to at least some level of ignorance on exactly how the missile warning system is coded into the game and how you would apply that to a ground realistic battle, I do think it is worth looking at into the dev's standpoint from at least looking at trying to give that capability to things like anti-air. If an anti-air spots a salvo of missiles being fired at its team, it should be able to mark those missiles for its team. And the game could also add something like a radio warning that you could issue to your team, something to the effect of missiles inbound, so that teammates would know to look to the skies and potentially take some sort of evasive action. This kind of system obviously wouldn't be infallible by any stretch of the imagination. You would have to know what the missile warnings mean, you would have to be aware enough of your surroundings to see them, you would also have to know what the counterplay was, and of course you would have had to research smoke grenades, but it does at least provide you with some options if a player can react fast enough and knows what to do, and ultimately I feel like that small amount of counterplay would be enough for most players to hate these planes a lot less. While this wraps up some of the core issues, there are still a few other points I would like to bring up. The first one is that one thing I have noticed universally, CAS is always more oppressive when it's always accompanied by good anti-air. The best case in point is USA. While the USA tech tree has plenty of good air, it has so few good anti-air that the planes are never really that hard to deal with, at least compared to some of the other nations. Germany at low tiers and Soviets at high tiers have some incredibly oppressive CAS, not just because the planes themselves are powerful, but they're usually accompanied by some of the strongest AA in the game, so often the planes can simply stay near the ground battlefield, and by trying to fight them, you risk getting taken out by hostile AA. Also, if the enemy gets in trouble, they can simply drag you over their own spawn and let their AA shred you to pieces. It becomes a bit of an issue because it does remove a core point of counterplay, and a plane is always better when it doesn't have to worry about other aircraft, or at least has to worry about it significantly less. While the developers have at least started the process of beefing up some of the anti-aircraft trees in the game, I still feel like it's woefully lacking in several key areas. Now this does bring up a fairly good viewer suggestion, and that is to add the ability to scout aircraft. Scouting aircraft would obviously highlight them a lot more easily for anti-air, although this is much like the missile spotting system in that I'm not sure how compatible the current system is with scouting aircraft. Obviously the scouting system sometimes scouts enemies through multiple buildings and other times can't scout the enemy sitting in an open field, so there is a bit of a spaghetti code situation going on there, and I'm not sure if that could be translated to aircraft in a meaningful way, but it would at least be a solution if it was viable. Now there was actually a fairly good point made by somebody, and this is worth bringing up, but it's also the type of topic that we don't have enough time to fully go into, at least not in this video, as it's well outside the scope of what we're looking at here. This viewer points out that CAS can be very snowbally. The best players get the most spawn points, which get planes, which become increasingly difficult to deal with as your team is losing and you start losing players. While in my opinion this is a fairly accurate description of what can often happen in matches when your team starts getting overwhelmed and that CAS basically keep you from having any potential for coming back, this is also just a core issue in any game that has a reward system that rewards you for doing well in that game. For example, Call of Duty and its kill streaks and score streaks has basically the same quote-unquote problem, and I have to put quotes around the term problem because one of the contributing factors to Call of Duty's success has been the kill streak and score streak systems. That's not to say that I necessarily want War Thunder to be like Call of Duty. If I wanted to play Call of Duty, I would just play Call of Duty. I am simply pointing out that there are valid design reasons as to why you may want this type of feature in your game, and it would be a mistake to assume that this is necessarily a bug and not a feature, that the game is not doing what it's designed to do. However, a deep dive on the advantages and disadvantages of these kind of systems, as well as the game design process that goes into them, is well outside the scope of this video, although it might be an interesting topic for a future video. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't address one of the most common suggestions on the topic of the CAS, and that is a ground vehicles only mode. Now, I'm going to be completely upfront on this one. I don't think this mode is happening anytime soon, at least not on any kind of large scale. And a big rationale for this is the ground RB game mode along with the air RB game mode are the flagship game modes of War Thunder. They're some of the most heavily played modes. And on top of that, based on the premiums that are sold, not just the ground vehicle premiums, but also helicopters and attack jets, these modes appear to be not only popular, but also very profitable for the company. So what you're essentially asking them to do by making a serious adjustment like this to the ground RB mode would represent a significant risk to their cash cow game mode, and I simply don't see the company doing this anytime soon, unless we got enough of an expansion to the player pool that they felt comfortable that it wouldn't adversely affect the matchmaker. That being said, it's acutely possible they might try to test the waters with an event mode, something like Sim or Heli PvE, where players could take a limited selection of ground vehicles into a ground-only match as a preliminary offering just to gauge interest, but I suspect any major shift to a ground-only game mode is still a very long ways away if it ever comes at all. That being said, I also do feel that taking aircraft into ground battles is a fairly significant part of War Thunder's identity as a game, and it's probably one of the things it's most well known for. Well, okay, other than the other thing that it's well known for, but anyway, you get the point. On top of that, a lot of people do like flying planes, and it is pretty fun to fly a plane. In fact, when you get destroyed in a ground vehicle, it's also pretty fun to go up and chase after and destroy that plane. So on the whole, I do feel like the game potentially misses out on a lot of engagement by doing this, and in doing so also runs the risk of homogenizing the experience a little too much, but I also feel at its core that players wouldn't fundamentally enjoy a ground realistic mode without aircraft any more than they enjoy the current ground realistic mode. I think this is the kind of thing that sounds much better in theory than it will ultimately be in practice. But ultimately, a lot of the subjects that we've discussed do beg the question, is CAS ultimately overpowered? And honestly, it very much depends on the battle rating in which you're playing at. From roughly 1.0 to about 4.0, the individual CAS planes and the individual anti-airs are somewhat internally well balanced. However, the issue is the planes are simply too easy to spawn, and the anti-airs, many of them at these battle ratings, aren't that useful against ground vehicles. So you end up in scenarios where the anti-airs simply get overwhelmed too easily. In that respect, I would say the low tier pendulum does slightly favor CAS, although not overwhelmingly so, and it's not quite to the point of being oppressive. From roughly 4.3 to 7.3, however, CAS ramps up rather significantly. The suspended ordnance gets better, the flight performance gets better, and the anti-airs that are contesting you are not really that different from the ones that were contesting you at low tiers. They're still manually tracked, manually guided guns firing up at you, and given how fast and how powerful some of these CAS aircraft can be, this simply isn't adequate in many scenarios. In a one-on-one, a lot of these fights will ultimately favor the plane, and this is a problem because these planes at these battle ratings still don't quite carry the kind of ordnance that actually makes them difficult to spawn. In that respect, I personally find the mid tiers is actually where CAS is the most powerful in the entire game, in part because of the ramping up of the power of the planes, but also because the spawn cost doesn't dramatically ramp up and the anti-air you fight against aren't really that substantial for the most part. From roughly 7.7 to 9.0, however, the pendulum swings completely in the other direction. While the planes still aren't generally that expensive to spawn, they don't dramatically ramp up in ordnance, and most of them are still using unguided bombs and rockets that don't even have a ballistic computer. Meanwhile, on the ground, you're now contested by radar-guided AAs like the Shilka, the Gepard, and the Vulcan that can tear you to pieces on a rocket or bomb run. Of course, here we get helicopters into the mix. However, helicopters are essentially hard countered by planes at this battle rating, as they don't yet have all the features that will make them an absolute menace to deal with much later. So in this respect, this is where CAS is effectively at its weakest. While you can certainly die to a plane or helicopter here, the anti-air options and the options to counter them in general are so substantial that the planes rarely do much. That being said, as soon as you go into the 9.3 to 10.7 bracket, the entire situation becomes a complete dumpster fire. The anti-air is everything from basic gun AA with proximity fuses all the way up to radar-guided missiles, and the ordnance being fired at you is everything from dumb rockets and bombs being dropped with a ballistic computer all the way up to fire and forget missiles. Add on to all of that a lot of players in this bracket are running premium vehicles, so the anti-air or air air they have access to is incredibly inconsistent, and the dumpster fire becomes a raging dumpster inferno. You could take out a plane and get instantly hard countered by the first thing you meet, or you could take out unguided bombs and rockets with a ballistic computer and clean up the entire enemy team, and everything in between. It really is just such a disaster that it actually ends up paradoxically being the best balance of all the battle ratings, because you never have any way of knowing what you're going to fight when you take an air or anti-air out. From 11.0 to 12.7, you have the top tier CAS bracket, the best CAS planes in the game fighting the best anti-air in the game, and on the whole, CAS ends up being fairly weak at this battle rating, but not because of any factors relating to anti-air. It turns out most top tier matches are incredibly short and incredibly bloody, so by the time you get the 900 or so spawn points you need for a fully equipped plane, or the 600 to 700 you need for a fully equipped helicopter with Vakirs or spikes, most of the enemy team or most of your team are already dead, and all you're doing is cleaning up or getting a few kills before you lose the match. Now, whether you think this fast-paced and bloody gameplay at top tier is a good thing or a bad thing is very much a topic for another video, as are all of the other factors that cause it to be so fast. But it is undeniable that usually by the time I'm taking any of these top tier CAS planes up, there isn't really all that much I can do to affect the battlefield. In that respect, I won't say top tier anti-air is irrelevant, but the top tier anti-air don't actually have to destroy the CAS planes, they simply have to drive them off long enough for the game to essentially be decided, and you will have made your mark. An F-15E that spends the better part of 2 or 3 minutes trying to take out a Panzer or two is basically doing nothing and probably watching their team lose in the process, or alternatively they might even be watching their team win but not able to engage in the feeding frenzy because the anti-air are keeping them at a distance. I could certainly see quite a few top tier CAS aircraft being a significant problem if the pace of play at top tier ever decreased to the point where you could really have a bonanza with them. However, as of right now, they simply aren't affecting the outcome of most of their matches. This also wraps around to an interesting point, because you'll notice a lot of my suggestions are less about directly nerfing CAS and more about adding more interactivity or adding more counterplay to CAS, because I feel like the core complaint a lot of players have is less that CAS is overpowered and more that it doesn't feel like there's anything they could do about it. So if you were to give players even a small amount of additional agency, they might not be as poorly disposed towards it, but that's just a theory on my part. Of course, those are just my thoughts on CAS in the game of War Thunder. Thank you for sticking with me through this entire discussion, and I appreciate everybody providing input in the comments. And of course, as you saw earlier, I do usually read the comments even if I don't necessarily get around to replying to all of them. If you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe is always appreciated. That always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.